In the end, it took a slight assist from a Ferrari meltdown, but Fernando, Alonso and Aston Martin did it. They delivered on the pre-season and early weekend hype to take a podium finish in their first F1 race together in Bahrain. It's a great validation for the major investment that has gone into the team since Lawrence Stroll acquired it in 2018, and everyone at Aston Martin, Alonso included, will be hoping this is just a first step on the road to something much bigger. But as well as shining a very bright light on all the work being done back at the team's Silverstone base, the superb debut for the AMR 23 has also raised some serious questions of what Aston Martin's rivals are up to, both the midfield teams it has jumped and the big hitters it humbled in Bahrain. Despite the slight assist from Charles Leclerc's Ferrari breaking down late on, Alonso had to earn this podium the hard way, battling past both Mercedes and Carlos Sainz's Ferrari to cap off a stunning debut with his new team. Alonso said this surpassed Aston Martin's initial expectations, as its goal for 2023 had been to get to the front of the midfield, with podium finishes not really part of that objective. Turning up for testing in the first race with the second best car on the grid, even if it's a long way behind the dominant Red Bull, was unexpected. Alonso called it too good to be true and said even during testing he was waiting for the step back to reality, but on this track at least, best of the rest behind Red Bull was Aston Martin's reality. Aston Martin even earned some admiring glances from comfortable winner Max Verstappen, who believes the team can win races this year. While that might seem like empty praise for a rival that Red Bull had covered, Verstappen's logic was that even in seasons where his car would be 40 seconds down on the race winners at most Grand Prix, he was still able to pick up a few wins at the right tracks or in the right circumstances. That's a prediction Verstappen will be a lot more comfortable with than anyone at Ferrari and Mercedes, who, as the established big front-running teams on the grid, should come away from Bahrain embarrassed by both the gap to Red Bull and the fact the team that finished 7th in the standings last year beat them to the final step on the podium. That probably wouldn't have been the case if Leclerc's car had kept running. Leclerc felt he would have held Alonso off without his engine problem, but even he conceded perhaps that picture was skewed by Alonso falling back at the start. But Ferrari's other driver Carlos Sainz said the team's predictions were that Aston Martin would beat them on Sunday due to Ferrari's inability to look after its tyres, and he was expecting Alonso to pass him earlier in the race. As Sainz put it, this is our reality right now, although Ferrari might be able to put up more of a fight on tracks that aren't so tough on tyres. As for Mercedes, Lewis Hamilton put it bluntly, saying we are the 4th fastest team. Unlike those at Ferrari, he didn't pin his team's problems on tyre management, saying it's not the tyres, it's just the car, we need to add downforce. But he was full of praise and congratulations for Alonso and Aston Martin for the amazing job they've done over the winter. He also pointed out the ultimate shame for Mercedes in all of this. As we'll explain in a bit more detail later on, Aston Martin takes components from Mercedes and uses the team's wind tunnel at the moment, and it's used those building blocks plus its own hard work and clever ideas to produce a much better car than Mercedes has. Hamilton said it's clear his team has a lot of work to do, given Alonso was in a different league when he caught and passed the Mercedes after a fun but all too brief battle on track. As Alonso was quick to point out after the race, Bahrain provides a very specific set of challenges for an F1 car and its ability to manage tyres, and with testing and the first race all happening at the same track, we'll need to wait for a few more races to get a true read on just how far this team has come. But even if it can't maintain its status as the second best on the grid, the season opener was validation that Aston Martin has indeed made a significant step. As we explore before the weekend, it has the potential to become the first team to conclusively bridge the divide from midfield into the lead group, a divide that has been a stubborn feature of F1's competitive picture for far too long. Doing that could include embarrassing some of F1's biggest teams on a more regular basis, but it would also shine a harsh light on its former midfield rivals. For McLaren and Alpine, Aston Martin's step puts a question mark over why those two teams have only managed fleeting spells at the front of the midfield. McLaren made a better go of bridging the gap than the Renault Works team, peaking as a semi-regular podium threat in 2020 and even claiming a win in 21. However, the first of those seasons especially was flattered by Ferrari's massive drop-off following an FIA clarification around engines that's too complicated to go back over here. But McLaren has regressed since and is pinning all of its hopes on the new wind tunnel and simulator that it says will eliminate all excuses by 2025. McLaren says Aston Martin's step is an incentive for the team. It's legitimate to question now, though, why McLaren has not been able to achieve the same thing already. Let's not forget, it's also a well-funded Mercedes customer team with a good workforce and the same ambition. Whether McLaren should really be doing a better job comes down to a simple question: is the wind tunnel really the problem? Aston Martin uses the Mercedes tunnel, which built title-winning cars for 8 years. McLaren's still renting the old Toyota facility in Cologne, which has limitations, big ones if you believe the team, thanks to the outdated technology and the inconvenience of it being overseas. But are those limitations such that it's impossible for McLaren to match Aston Martin? That seems a bit generous, especially as Aston Martin has other clear deficits to McLaren, such as their current factory setups. And there's another example that suggests McLaren's command of this aero formula is simply inferior. Buying the rear suspension and gearbox from Mercedes costs Aston Martin more under the terms of the cost cap than McLaren will be spending building those parts itself. That means theoretically McLaren should have more of its budget cap to spend on aerodynamic development. Yet it has still been clearly outdone by Aston Martin and dropped the ball so badly with its initial 2023 concept that we've already been told to wait for a heavily updated car to arrive a few races into the season. Of course, Aston Martin had something similar happen last year, but that was thanks to choosing the wrong concept at the beginning of a new rules cycle, not getting it wrong after having a year to work out which direction to take. If we give McLaren the benefit of the doubt, it needs to prove in 2025 that it was right to pin the blame on some specific tools rather than just admitting it's not doing a good enough job. Alpine doesn't have such an excuse. It did a better job than McLaren and Aston Martin last year and has made a step again this year that was perhaps a little disguised by a scrappy opening weekend. Then Aston Martin skewed the grading curve completely and suddenly Alpine's achievements over the last 18 months look mediocre by comparison. As one of F1's only real works teams, let's not forget, Alpine needs to be doing a better job. But its argument is that it's pursuing its own path, whereas Aston Martin has been able to take shortcuts as a Mercedes customer. Alpine has its own wind tunnel, which is still being improved, and Renault had a lot of technical leadership instability in recent years that is supposedly being ironed out in the Alpine era. The logic is that Alpine is ticking all the boxes it needs to, and while the process is a bit longer, it believes it will eventually be able to be 100% responsible for producing a front-running car. But let's also not forget that Renault has used the 2021 rebrand of this team to Alpine as a way of creating a reset point for the team's journey to the top. Renault has owned this team since the end of 2015, nearly 3 years before Stroll rescued Force India during 2018. But after Renault's initial rise to the front of the midfield faltered after that same 2018 season, the team lost its way. All the talk of the current 100-race plan, or whatever it is now, to get back to the front overlooks the fact that Renault's original 5-year plan to achieve that failed. Aston Martin, by contrast, has some new challenges looming. In addition to moving into its own wind tunnel when it's ready next year and adjusting to a new factory from May this year, it will eventually have to learn to take on manufacturing components that McLaren and Alpine are already competent at. At some point, Aston Martin will no longer be able to rely on Mercedes for things like the rear suspension, whether that's because Mercedes doesn't want to supply a rival or because the dependency puts a ceiling on Aston Martin's potential. The question is whether that kind of design and manufacturing work is as big a leap for Aston Martin as McLaren and Alpine have to make on the aero side. The combination of what Alonso describes as the unprecedented talent in the team and the promising simulation numbers while the new car was in development means Aston Martin was always cautiously optimistic about making a strong start to 2023. Team owner Lawrence Stroll's bombastic objective is to make Aston Martin one of the greatest F1 teams there will be, and he's put his money where his mouth is with admirable investment and aggressive recruitment. That applies not just to star names like Alonso and senior technical personnel such as Dan Fallows from Red Bull, Eric Blandin from Mercedes and Luca Forbato from Alfa Romeo, but also high-quality personnel brought in across the team to bolster the main workforce. The team has now grown to more than 700 people from its original headcount of 400 since the Stroll-led consortium acquired it in 2018. Alonso says the knowledge and talent in the team is probably unprecedented in F1, and while there's an element of classic Alonso hyperbole about that, Aston Martin has definitely tried to bring in extremely well-regarded people with different backgrounds and ideas. Fallows reckons it's a blend of the old-school Force India Racing Point people with their history of overachievement, bolstered by the many new recruits that has raised overall potential while maintaining the ability to punch above its weight. Fallows says Aston Martin hit most of its aggressive targets, with the car that is 95% different compared to last year's, and there's an aggressive upgrade program planned during the season. So unlike, say, a year ago when by midfield standards Haas and Alfa Romeo made giant killing starts to the new era, Aston Martin could be causing problems higher up the grid for a lot longer.